Caverly, wow. I was thinking we've known each other now since 2015. I believe we first met at the Generation X Dharma Teachers Gathering that was at Dharma Drum in New York. And it's been a joy ever since to, continue to get to know you and deepen our friendship. And actually, this is the first time that we've had an opportunity to do an event like this together. So it's a treat. And I really also enjoy just kind of seeing as you continue to expand your Dharma expression out in the world, which is one of the reasons we're here today, because of your wonderful new book, The Heart of Who We Are, Realizing Freedom Together. What I'd like to suggest at this moment is just take a moment to, since we all kind of, gathered in this room together, let's just take a moment to pause, to connect to presence itself in this moment. And so just feeling the contact of your body and being to the environment where you are, right where you are. Maybe to the chair you're sitting on, to the space of the room you're in, to the sense of connectedness of the screen and those who are here. And also bringing awareness to the breath, and flow of breathing in, being aware of breathing in, and when breathing out, being aware of breathing out. That's the flow of impermanence in this moment as it's manifesting. And particularly becoming aware of the breath in the abdomen, down in our hara, the center of our being, our body. And see if we can simply rest awareness there for a few moments. The invitation throughout our time together is to keep coming back to presence. Keep coming back to presence in whatever way most supports you. Whether that's coming back to the breath itself, to the feeling of embodiment in this moment, to any of your senses, any way that you can just stay connected to the feeling of aliveness, of being, presence, openness, bringing with it a sense of curiosity, invitation, receptivity as much as you can, as much as that is available to you in this time. Thank you all very much. And in our time together, it'd be lovely to hear a little bit from Caverly. What I would like to invite Caverly to share with us is what we call in Zen, which you probably know, this way-seeking mind. What has been your journey to the Dharma, the path of practice itself? And from the moment you first had that little spark that said, hey, there's something here. What is this? So thank you again, Caverly.
David, thank you. Again, I'm just so delighted. I was getting to tell you before the call that I'm just so delighted to be in conversation with you about things that I know we both share, which is a deep love of truth and practice. So I'm just delighted to be here. And I suppose in some ways that connects with the way-seeking story. When did I first feel called to dive deeply into, I like to think of it as matters of the heart. And it's interesting because I wrote my way-seeking story in the book, The Heart of Who We Are. And I have a kind of canned answer, But in this moment, I was present as you, just something in the way you worded what you worded. I got present to, I think maybe, did you say spark? Or there was just something about something lighting up
Mhm.
in your
Mhm.
words. And I had the image of being quite young. I loved riding horses. And I had just finished riding, and I was out in the field, and I had this profound connection with a cow in the field. And I remember looking deeply into the eyes of this cow. And I remember knowing that this cow, now I would use the language now, that this cow and I shared the same being.
Mhm.
I didn't have language like that when I was a child, but there was this recognition that this cow and I were made of the same stuff.
Mhm.
And of course, I grew up in Virginia, y'all, and I went home and I told my mom that I was going to become a vegetarian, that I couldn't eat my friends anymore. And my mother's famous quote to that was, "Over my dead body." Because I grew up in a town where, like, she had no idea how to cook vegetarian. She was like, "No way, you're not going down the road." So that's a whole other story. But I really think from a young age, I began to pay attention to those moments of recognition. And I think what called me to practice was learning that I could increase those moments of recognition intentionally. And so
Mhm.
once I learned about a meditation practice, I was in.
Mhm.
A friend gave me the book called "That Which You Are Seeking Is Causing You to Seek" by Sherry Huber. And all the lights came on as I read it. I was like, that's true, that's true, that's true. Never heard that said that way, but that's true, that's true. And so that book led to my first Zen retreat, which completely changed my life. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I was extremely moved by the glimpses that I experienced on that retreat, the glimpses of the remembrance of who I really am. And so I just began rearranging my whole life to go on every Zen retreat I could go on, until my teacher one day during one of our one-on-ones said, you could move to the monastery and train to be even more deeply seeped in these teachings. And I remember saying to her, as long as that doesn't make me a monk. And then of course I was there as a monk with her for 8 years. So that she tricked me on that one.
With a shaved head, right?
I did shave my head. It's true. It's true.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there's more I could say about that. And I also am so present to how many rich things we are hoping to touch on today, David. So I might just leave it at that for now. Just that's sort of what pulled me in. Zen, my roots are in this tradition of Zen practice, and I continue to be in love passionately with these teachings.
So let me ask you two questions then. What inspired you to write this particular book? And then I'm going to ask you a question about love.
Oh, all right. That sounds juicy. So this book, in this moment, what's alive to acknowledge is how much I needed to reconcile many different things that, until I wrote the book, felt unreconciled in me.
Mhm.
And I think for the purposes of our conversation today, one of the main things that I had trouble reconciling was the absolute truth, absolute reality, and the relative plane of experience. How do I reconcile this, what felt often like, it felt in my experience like a duality? How do I reconcile that? I also needed to reconcile for myself this progressive approach to training that I found incredibly useful, specifically a look at what gets in the way, what creates suffering, and a lot of attention on what gets in the way, I needed to reconcile that approach with an approach that I was introduced to after my monastic training. And that approach was a direct path approach. It was a let's go straight to the experience of recognizing who we are and have every other conversation come from that. And I needed to reconcile these different doorways into the same truth. And then lastly, I'd say that I needed to reconcile something around the personal and the collective in terms of transformation and liberation. So I knew the benefit of personal practice. I was really clear about that, even as a monastic. It didn't take long, in other words, to be clear, like, okay, personal practice helps. It's really that simple. And I felt that in my training context, there was a big leaving out of everything that had to do with the collective. How is the collective suffering? What are collective systems of suffering? How can I reconcile personal practice with this recognition of collective? So that was something I had to reconcile after being a monastic, and after very specifically learning more about my own position in society, learning about how privilege operates in society, learning about systemic structures of oppression, learning about all the isms, racism, sexism, classism, learning about how does practice tie in with that other than just my own personal practice. So one of the things the book aims to do is connect personal and collective.
Mhm, mhm. And I think you do a beautiful job of that, just the way that you kind of lay the foundation for the understanding, in a way of understanding relative and absolutes, as well as how do we navigate the personal and the collective, what we need to be aware of in all those different realms, which are totally, they're not separate realms. As part of what, we come to understand through practice, the non-duality of these different aspects. And so, yeah, I'm so happy you chose this as an exercise to a reconciliation for yourself, and your own understanding, which I think so much of practice is about. It really is. How do I make sense of what looks like difference and separation, and how do I feel a deeper sense of connectedness to everything, and live from that place of connectedness. Right? Live from the heart of who we are, as I think you would say. So I don't know how many people here have read the book itself, but it's a very provocative title, The Heart of Who We Are. What is that? What is the heart of who we are?
Well, first, I just have to acknowledge that you skipped your love question, and that's just, deeply disappointing to me. I wanted to hear if you were going to ask how I met my husband. By the way, we met online. So, the heart of who we are, it's a really fun story, actually. I wanted to call the book Collective Liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And I got some really important feedback from dear close friends in my life who are people of color, who acknowledged that while they understood why I would want that title, there was a problematic nature to it, given that people of color specifically have been talking about collective liberation for a very long time. And there's such a huge pattern of white people then coming in and saying, like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, this is something I'm now going to take as my title. And I appreciated, as I did more homework, that there's this long history of what collective liberation means in many different communities. I happen to grow up in a community where no one ever said those words.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate, I was talking to my dear friend, Eve Shipman, and Eve, which I was just reflecting with Eve these observations, and Eve, who is a Black woman, was one of the people saying, like, hey, pay attention. And I appreciate that. She said, well, tell me more about what the book really is about. And I said, well, it's about the heart of who we are. And she said, stop, that's your title. And I appreciate that without her reflection, I would not have realized that that's actually what the title needed to be, because there's something kind of cognitive even about the phrase collective liberation in relationship with what I actually ended up writing about. The book has a lot of heart in it. Very specifically, it's inviting all of us to remember the heart and not leave the heart out in our journey of practice. I came from a Zen tradition that was very strict in terms of my monastic training. And I have countless stories of how I forgot about the heart, y'all. And so it was really important for me to remember the heart on that plane. And then in terms of reconciliation, I love the way the heart also could refer to the heart of awareness. What is the heart of awareness? What is the heart of the teachings? So I really liked that play of the heart of who we truly are being one way to talk about, I am not these thoughts, I am not these emotions, I am not this body. Who and what is the heart of who I am? What is it that is unchanging? What is it, as Zen Master Bankei said, what is the unborn mind? And what is the heart of the unborn mind?
So some places, as I was reading your book, I think you even say it somewhere, the heart of who we are is love, and awareness as, love itself. But love is such a loaded term, and it's got so many facets to it and means so many different things. And so can you say more about love in the sense of
I mean, it was fun to be tongue in cheek about how I met my husband, because that's one plane of reality, right? Where love exists. I will say my favorite definition of love continues to be something I heard on a retreat once with Rupert Spira. And his definition was, at least in that moment, love is the recognition of shared being. And I honestly think that's what happened with that cow. That moment where any sense of separation falls away. Any shred of a story that there is an other is, to me, love. And so I've come to, over time, use love very often interchangeably with pure consciousness, with awareness in the broadest sense of the word awareness. And I do it very specifically in the book. I make a distinguishing. I distinguish between love with a lowercase l and love with a capital L. And really, at the heart of who we are, what I'm pointing to is love with the capital L.
I also, when I first came across Rupert's definition of love as the knowing of our shared being, I really resonated that, and I have myself been using that as kind of a definition. And I also like that he defines happiness as the knowing of our own being. So there's happiness, the knowing of our being, and then there's love, the knowing of our shared being, and how they are fundamental to our being, period, right? And how do we get in contact with both of those in a way? Because we all want to be happy. That's, a driving edge energy to know ourselves completely, to be ourselves completely, to be the wholeness of our being, and then relate and connect to others from that, knowing of that being, which is knowing of the same being, if you will, and being able to continue to stay in contact with that truth, that understanding, keeping that forefront in our hearts and minds at all times. So, well, thank you for sharing that. We titled this workshop, "What is True Freedom?" And of course, building from the subtitle of your book, "Realizing Freedom Together." And so this, again, it's not an endeavor we can do alone. We can only know freedom as a shared activity, a shared path, a shared process. But of course, there's this question then is, what's your definition of freedom? What exactly are you talking about when you're talking about freedom? And for some, it's this power, the right to act or speak or think as one wants without hindrance or without restraint. So it that implies a freedom from something that limits us or binds us or constricts us. And then another part is freedom within. And Suzuki Roshi has a whole chapter in his book, Not Always So, titled "Freedom from Everything." And he talks about, when we sit zazen, particularly when we're sitting shikantaza, which means just sitting, just minding the experience activity of sitting, just giving ourselves and our minds over to this experience of sitting and presencing, our experience in the moment, that we have freedom from everything, is how it says. So freedom comes, in that case, from non-attachment, from non-grasping. And then there's this other sense of freedom, which is freedom within, which is, often Zen talks about this, within karmic conditions. There is a way we can still be free within the circumstances. That's not about getting outside of them, but being within them and finding our freedom within them. There's a third valence of freedom, what I think of as freedom of or freedom as, but I won't go yet there. But I'm kind of curious, what is your framing of true freedom?
Well, David, I'm so stimulated by this. As you know, when we were chatting a little bit before our time together, I realized we could spend 90 minutes just talking about true freedom. What is true freedom? Because there's so many different dimensions to this. And I appreciate that you just focused on two. And of course, not a surprise that I fully resonate with everything you said about freedom up until this point. There's so many different directions we could go, but since you were just speaking about the karmic piece, one way I like to talk about that is the freedom that comes from conditioned patterns. So I'm conditioned to behave a certain way in the world. I'm conditioned to believe particular things. I want to pause and just say hello and welcome to, I believe, Stefan, have you just joined? Welcome.
Yeah, I'm here at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. So hi, how are you?
Hello, welcome. Thank you. So there's freedom from conditioned patterns, David, is I think what you and I both, one of the things that I know we have in common about practice, being able to see as I practice, I'm able to watch my own conditioned patterns and not feel as hooked by them, to have more skill around what I like to talk about is disidentifying from the conditioned mind, or as you acknowledge, like unhooking, I believe was a word you used. This does happen to be another place of reconciliation, because there's this, there are many ways to think about freedom. And I think all of them stem from the same felt experience. And the freedom I wanted to focus on in this moment is the freedom that's inherent, the freedom that that is not something we strive to attain. As you and I are acknowledging, David, there is, if a community of people is working together to be to pay attention to how patriarchy operates within that community, the community, if they're paying attention, will become more free as practice, as attention is brought to that issue. In the book, one of the places in the book, I asked that question: what does it mean to be free? And my response in this section of the book is to know the reality of all things, to know the truth of who you are, the truth prior to the arising of duality, and then from the knowing of reality to do what you will, to move how the heart calls, to move from the heart of who we are. And so that's something I was hoping you and I, given we're both in love with freedom on all realms, that's something that I thought might be juicy for us to bring some attention to. The freedom that's inherent, the freedom that is the recognition of who we truly are, the freedom that would be one way to describe who we experience ourselves to be when we're not hooked by conditioned patterns, believing that I am these thoughts, I am these emotions, I am this body, etc.
as you were speaking, this thing I remember from a while back is, I don't know if someone said it, was that everything when given attention is self-liberating.
Everything when given attention is self-liberating.
So this idea that as thoughts, feelings, body sensations, anything within our field of awareness arises, as long as we're giving it attention, as long as we're holding it in awareness, it liberates itself. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to
Yes.
do anything with the thoughts or feelings and so on. So, and it's the same with our own being. We're already free, our nature is free. It's the very Buddha mind is already free. And when we acknowledge the nature of all being, of all Buddha mind, in our engagement with it, it realizes its own freedom and does what it does, right? And so that kind of unfolding. So that for me, when I sit in Zazen, I come back and I just sit. And my effort is don't do anything. Don't do anything. Just observe, just be this open awareness. Settle into this deeper, it's a felt sense of presence, of
Yes.
openness, of boundlessness that allows everything to arise, to be known, and then to pass away. And then I study, what am I grabbing onto? What am I grasping? Oh, that's a juicy thought. I want that thought. I want more of that thought. Oh, no more of that thought. Ooh, that sensation. I don't want that. That, painful knees. I don't want that. Oh, this other something, fantasy. Oh, great. Love that, so on. So all this moving when our activity in Zazen is just to be stillness itself, to be silent and still, to allow the energy to kind of return to the source, right? And rest there. And then know our innate freedom and know the innate freedom of everything that arises, because everything is this boundless, spacious awareness just playing, just this field of playing with itself, to freely play, to enjoy that play, the sense of joy that comes out of that activity. So, and it's so hard to do that, not only in Zazen, it's hard to do that when we get off the cushion and go into our lives, right? And suddenly everything kind of, our minds just contract again around so much around the sense of self, the sense of story, the narrative of me, mine, I, this false belief of separation that we keep enacting out of, and so painfully, right?
So painfully. And yet the pain becomes comfortable, doesn't it? It's like, we all know that place of like, oh my gosh, this is creating such suffering, but it's familiar. I understand it. I know what's going to happen. It's comfortable even. Yeah. David, when you were talking, when you first were describing what you were describing, I realized there's also another way. My first Zen teacher used to talk about paying attention, how if we're paying attention, you were talking about how everything sort of can enlighten us in a sense. Everything is able to be recognized as arising out of consciousness, known by consciousness, returning to itself in a sense, not that it ever left itself. But there's this other way my teacher used to talk about it that I found very helpful in practice, which is a sense of, if you're paying attention, everything will enlighten you, because you'll see, okay, does that lead towards suffering or does that lead away from suffering? So there's that kind of nuanced way to think about it as well. That's such a gift of practice. If I'm paying attention, it becomes harder and harder to miss what leads towards suffering and what leads away from it. Not that it's perfectly dualistic, but a helpful framing, right?
That's beautiful. I love that. I love that a lot. And there was another quote I came across. I know, it's uncertainty is the price of freedom. Uncertainty is this price of freedom. So to sit in a space of don't know mind, and rest there and be uncertain and be okay with not knowing exactly what I'm supposed to do and how I'm going to do it, and just rest in that, in the process, what comes forward is a sense of intimacy, this deeper connectedness, right?
Yes.
And yeah, it's really quite beautiful.
It's quite beautiful. And I didn't realize when I was writing the book that for me, don't know mind is such a specific thing. Like something I say a lot of because of my history with Zen.
Mhm.
And I didn't realize until actually just this week, I had someone show up to an offering. They actually sent an email before the offering based on having read the book saying like, can you say more about don't know mind? And I realized that until it's clarified, a lot of people might think don't know mind is just like that experience when you're young, where you don't know the answer to something and you feel like you're on the spot and it's really terrible. And so I want to acknowledge that the way you're talking about don't know mind is another way to talk about freedom. It's freedom from the constriction of the limitation of the conditioned mind that asserts it knows everything and sees the world through the lens of duality, sees the world through the lens of right, wrong, good, bad, this, that, and most importantly, I think, in terms of our suffering, sees the world through the lens of subject and object. I am an I in relationship with the world, others, all separate from me, all the object of my experience.
So how do we work with that? How do we work with that tendency to, dwell, in these dualities?
Well, I will acknowledge, and then I do want to just say that I did see, Griffin, you raised your hand, and so maybe I'll just respond to David, and then we'll pause for a question. This is where I could speak again about what in my own practice has been beneficial regarding paying attention to how the conditioned mind operates, paying attention to patterns of thinking. This again could be called a progressive path of moving through various steps in practice in order to have understanding first of what we are not. And then, leading to a direct experience of who we are. That was all a long-winded way of acknowledging that I have found that before we just go to an experience of the non-dual, in my own practice, it's been very helpful to understand the dual. So even in our Peace in Schools curriculum with teens, there is a way to begin seeing how the conditioned mind, there is support in guiding students to see how the conditioned mind sees the world through the lens of duality.
Right.
How does duality work? How is duality structured? If I can see it out, first we look and we see it out here. And this is actually one of the things I do in the book too, is I support a reader in going through and seeing, okay, what does it feel like to be stuck in that lens of duality, to be bouncing back and forth between right and wrong and good and bad and this and that. But I think it's very important in practice to be clear about how duality arises, how it operates, who we are in relationship to dualistic thinking. In other words, we become an I in relationship with whatever the hologram of duality is. And then from there, in my own experience, our relationship with the non-dual becomes informed, even richer. Something we can access through many different doorways and windows. Of course, it's ever present. Of course, it's not something there's an I that accesses. But again, language fails us. So for the purposes of this part of the conversation, hopefully that makes sense.
Zen is fundamentally about relationship. It's studying our relationship. It's understanding our relationship, how everything is related, interbeing, right? And then understanding our relationship to all experience in the way that leads to either liberation or to suffering, and that's the fundamental activity, to study that, the studies, the self, and then to kind of find a new way to be in relationship that is liberating.
Yeah, so, well said.
usually this idea of we need to liberate ourselves first. And then there's this widening the circle for a collective liberation. And sometimes that's a little bit of the early Buddhist kind of flavor, is this kind of self-liberating emphasis on that. And the Mahayana, the later Buddhist turning is the Bodhisattva, where all beings are turned, where I won't be free until all beings are free. You know, how our endeavor, our deepest intention vow is to stay in what, you know, some would say this cycle of being, you know, until every being is free, experiences liberation in some way. So I just want to invite you to say a little bit more about this kind of collective liberation and how that might unfold.
Thank you, David. One thing that just occurred to me too, as we sort of took a pause and transitioned to a potentially like different direction, it occurred to me at some point, it would be nice to insert a little practice. So maybe
Oh, yeah.
to meditate together a little bit. But before we do that, this is part of what I wanted to reconcile with the book. And I don't by any means feel like, oh, I got that reconciled and now that's done. I mean, for me, we're living into these questions for forever. And because you've already spoken so beautifully to the relationship and in the history of Buddhism, that's something I really appreciate about our friendship, is that I learn a lot from you about kind of how Buddhism is traditionally framed particular things. For the people on this call, there were many times during the writing of the book that I called David and I said, okay, bounce this off with more of a historical context for me. And so anyway, I really appreciate that. Because you've spoken to that, the sort of personal, the collective, the recognition of personal being, other beings, I actually want to focus for a moment on the way I end the book. So I hope I'm not deterring anyone who hasn't read it from reading it by, how many of you are people who are going to buy a book and then like go read the last few pages before you start reading the book? I was never that person, but you all look horrified. You all are like, oh, people do that. But yes, people do. So I feel a little bit remiss to do this on that level of, I almost feel as though I'm giving something away, and yet
We know it all ends in love, Caverly.
it all ends with love, and David already gave that away at the beginning. So I will pull this quote from the very end of the book, and it speaks to what Griffin what he was sharing earlier. Freedom is who we are, not what we attain. There is no separate self. Therefore, there is no collective. So let's do this as a collective together. And the let's do this is let's do the work of collective liberation together. And so I wanted to focus for a moment on that, given that we haven't said too much about that yet. So yes, there's the personal, how am I suffering? How does practice support me in ending my suffering? As the book does for the entire book, every chapter has practices where we're taking practices that I originally experienced as a Zen monk, we're applying them collectively. That's, I think, one of the things that's actually somewhat unique about the book is we're taking personal practice. Now we're saying, okay, what if you took that one personal practice and then you did it, not only did it in Sangha, because that's pretty common to do personal practice in Sangha, but to take a practice and apply it to collective experience. So there's personal, there's collective in that way. But I want to focus again right now on the punchline being, we speak so much in Zen about no self. We must also apply that to no collective. What do you have to say in response to that, David?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, you know, it's You've probably all heard the saying before, before you begin practice, a mountain is a mountain. Then you start practicing, and a mountain is no longer a mountain. And then, further along in practice, becomes a mountain again. But you understand the nature of the mountain. You understand its interdependent, co-arisen nature. And you understand the causes, or as much as you can, the causes and conditions that give rise to that mountain. So the freedom is in this understanding how things are and how they came to be and what we might do differently to change them. This is the Buddha's Four Noble Truths. There is suffering and there's, a cause of suffering, right? And there's, a sensation of suffering, and then there's a path for the sensation of suffering. But the fundamental thing is suffering arises, we know, and to really understand the causes for suffering. And then what are we going to do to change that? So suffering is no longer arising. So much I think about, what I'm learning over these, last number of years is really focusing on how is our collective suffering arising? Well, how are we taking our limited sense of self and literally creating institutions that recreate that, manifest that mind of separation, that mind of othering, the ways that they operate, the ways that they communicate, the structures of the institutions, and so on. It's all manifesting this narrative of other, separate in some way. And so, how do we then begin to deconstruct our social relationships, our social systems, to be able to question that narrative and then explore what's a new, way of reconfiguring our social systems, our way of being together in a community, in society, on the planet, in a way that is deeply embodied and embedded in this shared being, in the sense of dependently co-arisen, right? And that's not an easy thing to do, though. I feel overwhelmed half the time when I start looking at, frankly, just at San Francisco Zen Center, in what ways are we still, manifesting limited, ways of being, right? We come, Zen-sens here, come out of a Zen, out of patriarchal, system, and what ways do we undo that, right? As an institution that has a lot of white body leadership, how is that, that white supremacy lens, just despite our best intentions, still shaping and influencing the flavor of the practice, the space, how we all show up with each other. It's a constant inquiry. It's a constant question. There's no end to it. This undoing, of structures and systems that we create the sense of separation, that fundamental fallacy. Sometimes I get torn between, I can just focus on this one. I can barely take care of this one and deconstruct this one's limited mind, much less try to work with all the other systems that are around me in my community. But again, this Bodhisattva vow, I'm not free until everyone is free. So I have to make my best effort. I just have to. And it's going to be incomplete. It's going to be imperfect. There's not going to be any end to it. But it's the practice itself of making the effort that is the mind of realization, as Dogen would say, practice realization, so I have to make the effort to change the systems, internal and so-called external, even though they aren't internal and external. We know that at some level, and yet they are, right? And so I can still dance on the mountain and enjoy dancing on the mountain, dancing with the mountain, dancing as the mountain. But it's a dance of liberation.
David, I love that so much, and I'm so appreciative of the energy behind your words. They're so, they spark my own felt sense of what you're saying, as you're speaking. And I want to add on a sort of yes and. And so for me, the yes and is it comes back to this place of reconciliation. And then what's shifting when I'm even questioning who is the I that feels I need to save all sentient beings?
Mhm.
Who am I seeing myself to be as I perceive other sentient beings? Who am I identifying with and as if I see my own suffering and call that me, and then look at a collective and call that collective suffering, therefore creating a split in some cases? And what changes with our, just to confuse the conversation even more, what changes with our effort, because here I am talking about non-effort, but what changes with our effort when our effort in the world is deeply steeped in the recognition that there are no sentient beings,
Mhm.
that all that's arising is, if we were to compare an analogy, a hologram of sorts, but all is made of the same exact consciousness. So yes, on one level, of course, there's me. I'm over here on Whidbey Island. I am not sitting where David is in San Francisco. These are different body minds, different conditioning. So of course, like acknowledging all of that, of course, you are a on one realm, separate sentient being than me. The cow on one realm is a separate sentient being for me that I experienced a connection with as a child. But I'm very interested in how does our work in the world in the name of liberation for all shift when our practice is about not leaving the recognition that there truly is no other.
Mhm. Mhm.
There is simply undifferentiated being
Mhm.
taking various form.
And the experience of that, I mean, it's resting in that, abiding in that knowing, right? In that felt sense. I personally go back and forth. It's just like, it's just like some days I'm there, other times, moment to moment. Sometimes I see it, and other times it's not even, it's not so much a seeing, it's a knowing, right? This is profound knowingness, of that truth, and then it gets clouded over, it gets veiled over by this kind of old narrative, old conditioning that happens. So I try to set up for myself, I know that, yes, I know that. I need so many reminders. This is why I practice. This is why I live in community. This is why I keep, Zazen every day and coming back to Dharma teachings. I need those reminders moment by moment because I'm not yet, don't tell anyone, I'm not yet enlightened. I'm not abiding 100% of the time in this uh, boundless awareness. I am, but I'm not, so it's this kind of, what helps me to remember that, that's for me and when I try to support others, in their practice, that's a key fundamental question. How do we remember? How do we help each other to remember, to return to that knowing of shared being, for shorthand, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. As you know, David, every chapter of this book that we've been referencing starts, the subtitle of that chapter starts with remembering
Mm-hmm.
blank. I can't remember now even. Let me just actually glance real quick because I really am curious to give it accurately. It's not remember, it's return to.
Return to, yeah.
I know it's not quite there yet, but the return to is so that we might remember.
Right.
Return to truth, return to connectivity, return to shared being.
Oneness, yeah.
Return to oneness, return to unity. And I remember my publisher in the beginning was like, oh, that's way too repetitive. you're going to need to, because I was just an outline at the beginning. She's like, you'll need to change all that. And I was like, okay, that's fine. I've never written a book for adults. I'm very open to changing that. And then she read the book and she said, nope, that's exactly how it needs to be. Return to this, return to this. And one of the reasons I like that is for the reason that you're pointing to. It suggests that what we're returning to is something that we maybe forgot we know, but is, in fact, as we've been talking about, our direct experience. Even if I walk around the world forgetting myself as unified being, it's still ever present, and therefore, for the part you're speaking to, the part of you that sort of remembers, right? Being never forgets itself. Consciousness is never forgetting itself, but we, as these body minds that are walking around through the world, even though we're made of pure consciousness, as our attention is mixed up with the objects of whatever we're attending to, we forget ourselves as pure awareness or pure consciousness or love with a capital L. So I agree. That's what I love about practice. And the more that I practice, the more I realize that practice becomes a non-practice as well as a practice, and that's another place of reconciliation.
Thank you, Caverly. Sandy, I've seen your hand. Invite you to.
I just had a thought while you were asking the question that we're all asking, is how do I remember all the time? We can't remember all the time. We keep going back and forth. And I think one little key that might be helpful is to practice learning to recognize it in each person we encounter.
Beautiful practice. It's one of the practices in my book, Sandy, is really seeing another essence to essence. Even with our teenagers through the Peace in Schools program, we're teaching that language of essence to essence, because we're so used to seeing the masks that we wear, right? Like, I see you, Sandy, as a particular gender or a particular race or a particular occupation. I identify you with the occupation that you've told me you have. But meeting each other essence to essence is a real shortcut into the recognition of shared being. So I appreciate you brought in that as a practice.
Thank you.
Well, shall we have a little meditation together?
Please, yeah. So we can remember who we are.
There we are.
The activity or non-activity.
So this won't be long, friends, but I did want there to be an opportunity for, as you've heard, my love of direct experience. It can be so easy to unpack all of these things with the mind that creates the appearance of duality. And this is a brief meditation to remind us to allow that mind to sink into the heart. And welcome. I believe we have another person who just joined. Welcome. I invite you in this moment to be comfortable and just for this brief meditation, to allow yourself to set aside your beautiful and valid concentration practice if you're coming into this call and you have a strong concentration practice. So rather than focusing the attention on the breath or any specific object, the breath just being a subtle object, for this very brief meditation, I want to invite you to allow the attention to soften and to rest in its source. awareness itself. An image I sometimes use with this is if we habitually think of the attention like a flashlight, and with no practice at all, maybe my flashlight is just bouncing all over the place, thing to thing to thing, thought to emotion to, and just the list goes on of all the different objects. When I first learned a meditation practice and learned to use the breath as an anchor, I was learning to have that flashlight become steadied. It was the most empowering thing I'd ever learned. I could place my attention where I wanted it to be. And now for this meditation, we're letting the light draw back into the flashlight itself. We're letting the attention rest. For this style of meditation, we're allowing everything to be exactly as it is. Without even having to unhook from something, the mind can simply do what the mind does. Rather than seeing yourself as that which is applying effort to focus the attention or concentrate or steady the attention. In this approach, we're allowing being to shine. To shine at the forefront of experience. And we're simply resting in that. As that. From here, you don't have to be good. You don't have to be able to focus well. You don't have to be disciplined. You don't have to save yourself. You don't have to save anyone else. You are free. So we're resting together in freedom. as freedom. We're resting in love. As love. For the next 3 minutes in silence together, simply being. Remembering the heart of who we are. And then I'll invite as a way to close out this brief meditation together, I'll invite you to take 3 of the longest and deepest inhalations and exhalations you've taken yet today as a community, but in your own time. Thank you, friends.
So maybe in the few moments we have remaining, if there's any burning questions, anything you want to bring forward in this moment, invitation, space to do that. I like sometimes the word remember, remembering, this idea of to reconnect our members of our being, you know, like our body, limbs, reconnecting this sense and reclaiming the whole body, the whole universal body of being.
Mm.
and then moving from that collective re-embodied, remembered quality as we go from our meditation place into our day-to-day life, which in Zen is no different.
You know, David, I really appreciate the word reclaiming right now. I don't use that word a lot, and I think it's important. As I said, you know, when I learned I could direct my attention and learn to steady it through practice, that was so empowering to me. There's something very empowering about reclaiming the heart of who we are. And then in the book, I talk a lot about acts of being. And what I mean by that are allowing acts in the world, action in the world to be on behalf of that knowing of who we truly are, to reclaim the knowing and then move from that recognition, or as we were saying earlier, from that direct experience. I just, yes, I'm going to be repeating reclaiming for a while now. That's just lovely.
Unless there's any other questions, I wanted to maybe if you just take a moment to say something more about the upcoming 6-week class and how that might unfold in terms of what you're thinking. And there were, I think in the description, you talk about, you know, exploring 5 essential contemplative life skills, which is, you know, part of what our practice is about. Would you care to say more about that?
Yes, thank you. I'm really, I'm quite excited about the opportunity to have this 6-session course in which we're going to move through a series of practices together, personal practices that are also connected to collective practice, not only collected, but connected to, but also just a manifestation of collective practice. And these contemplative life skills that David's referring to are relating, dismantling, inquiring, returning, and realizing. And I've been thinking of this lately as a path to realizing freedom together. These sort of points of a star, if you will. So that's what we'll be doing as a community. And I feel very honored that that'll be happening through the San Francisco Zen Center. And I'm excited to be part of this community and part of this offering. And the offering will only be what it is through community. So please join if you feel called. The more the merrier.
I really appreciate it. In the book, you have at the end of each chapter kind of a personal exercise practice, but also a collective practice where you invite people to get together with others, you know, friends and peers and colleagues and so on, and do a collective exercise together, which is in the spirit of the class also. So
yes, it's important to me because it's not going to be a class that underscores personal practice in the way that most of the classes I had direct experience with before becoming a monastic. Well, I'll say it this way. Before I really committed my life to practice for me was something where I was always trying to improve myself in some way, even if I was getting smart enough to not call it self-improvement. And this time together will make it really clear that's not what we're doing here. We're recognizing our inherent awakeness together, and we're exploring together on where are the rubs, where are the places we forget, where are the places we get confused about who we really are, and can we explore those places together? So thank you.
thank you. And thank you, Helena, for putting the link to the class into the chat field. And anything else, Caverly or Helena?
Well, I'll turn it to Helena in just a moment. I did just drop my URL too. That's just caverlymorgan.org if you do want to learn a little bit more about me. And that also will guide you to pick up a copy of the book, The Heart of Who We Are, Realizing Freedom Together, if you would like to. And Helena, thank you. I will happily turn it over to you.
Well, thank you both. Thank you to our two esteemed teachers. So delightful to have you both here sharing your wisdom with us and facilitating this. So in the chat right now, I'm just throwing a feedback form at the very top that we really hope that you can have a chance to fill out. And just so you know, this will all be in a follow-up email too, so you don't have to rush to get that in. And then underneath there are just some ways to stay connected to San Francisco Zen Center by signing up for our newsletter, donating or becoming a member. And at the very bottom is a link to Caverly's book. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our teachers, and we will see you in the next one. And have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you again, everyone. Thank
Thank you so
Caverly.
much. Mhm.